Hi, everyone. Welcome to our podcast, Conversations with B'nai B'rith. I'm B'nai B'rith CEO Dan Mariaschin. In this episode, I'll speak with Jeffrey Gurock, professor of Jewish history at Yeshiva University, about his new biography of Marty Glickman, a preeminent voice of New York sports and, for many reasons, an American Jewish sports icon. If you enjoy this program, subscribe to Conversations with B'nai B'rith wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating. And you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and like us on Facebook for all of our latest content. For nearly half a century, from the late 1940s until the 1990s, Marty Glickman was the voice of New York sports. He spent years as the television and radio broadcaster for just about every New York team, including the Giants, the Jets, the Knicks, the Rangers, plus pre- and post-game coverage of the Yankees and the Brooklyn Dodgers. He was even the first TV announcer for the NBA. Glickman has also been remembered as a Jewish athlete who, a decade before he sat in front of a microphone, was cynically barred from running in a signature track event at the 1936 Olympics in Berlin by anti-Semitic American Olympic officials. As explained by historian and Yeshiva University professor Jeffrey Gurock in his new biography, Marty Glickman, The Life of an American Jewish Sports Legend, Glickman's life is so much more than the teams that he covered, and the book much more than a book about sports. We're glad to have Jeff with us today to explore Glickman's contributions to American popular culture and his experience as a successful American Jew in the 20th century. Jeffrey Gurock is a historian and the Libby M. Clapperman Professor of Jewish History at Yeshiva University. He's written or edited 25 books, including Jews in Gotham, which in 2012 was honored as the Everett Family Foundation Jewish Book of the Year by the Jewish Book Council. Jeff, welcome. So delighted to have you with us today.
Well, thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to reconnect with a friend of long standing. We go back many, many years together, and I'm so pleased that you're interested in this book. And thank you for saying that it is far more than just a sports book. But as a sports book, I have to tell you that Marty Glickman, as you correctly said, was the voice of my youth growing up in New York City. I'm 74 years old, and that was the guy we turned to. When I played basketball in the streets, if I made a basket, I would say swish, because Marty Glickman said swish. Long before Iron Eagle would say bank it, and Mike Green would say bang, we had swish. And then I'd say, I'm as good as the games at Nedick's. Now, Nedick's was this terrible place. Now, being a kosher eater, I didn't eat the lousy hot dogs, but I had those, the orange juice. It was situated right outside the old garden of 49th Street and 8th Avenue. And you had to wind your way away from all the bookies who hung out under the marquee, so to speak. So Marty Glickman was someone who I related to and listened to. I listened to him under the covers with a transistor radio in my ear. One time, Marty Glickman was broadcasting a game, and he said, wherever you are in New York City, open the windows of your tenement or your apartment and yell, "Go Giants, go! Go Giants, go!" So I did that. My father said to me, "What in the world are you doing?" I said, "Marty Glickman told me to scream, 'Go Giants, go! Go Giants, go!'" Dan, this is when we had professional football in New York City. That isn't the way things are today in terms of the quality of the Jets and Giants. In the book, I tell a story about the Giants had a game against the Minnesota Vikings, and it was a very close game, 2 minutes to go in the game. And Marty Glickman's broadcasting, and he says, if you're within the sound of my voice, pull off the road. I don't want to cause any accidents. When a friend of mine told me that story, I thought he made it up until I found two other sources which document that. Mike Burke, who later on became the president of the New York Yankees, wrote in one of his memoirs that he was on the Sawmill River Parkway and people were pulling off the road. And then I interviewed someone who was in Brooklyn on Flatbush Avenue. He weaved his way across 3 lanes to listen to Marty Glickman. That's how important Marty Glickman was to us as a sportscaster. But as you said correctly, there's far more to Marty Glickman's life than the sports experience. By the way, so many of the great broadcasters today were disciples of Marty Glickman, including the first women who were broadcasters. Gail Serens did the first NFL game as a woman. There's a woman named Beth Mowens who a few weeks ago I heard her broadcasting a game on CBS, a football game. So there's a lot about Marty Glickman as a broadcaster. But this is B'nai B'rith, and we're Jews, and there's a Jewish side to Glickman, more than the fact that when he broadcasted the game, occasionally he'd use Yiddish phrases. This Meshuggah ran for 10 yards. This crazy man ran. So as a Jew in New York, hearing Yiddish being pronounced by a broadcaster was very significant to me. So a piece of the book, I'm a dual threat. Part of the book is a sports book about a great sports broadcaster. But as you know, there's far more to Marty's story than just his broadcasting and all his disciples.
Well, Jeff, let's kind of set the scene. Marty was born in the Bronx, but he was raised in Brooklyn, went to James Madison High School, and was an athletic phenom. That's really where the story begins. Tell us a little about what the Brooklyn of Marty Glickman was like when he was at James Madison High School.
Sure. He's a paradigmatic second-generation Jew, child of immigrants who came from Romania, who were doing very well in the 1920s and not very well in the 1930s during the Great Depression. The family moves to Brooklyn, to the Flatbush section, where he talks about his friendships, his interaction with German Americans and Italian Americans and Irish Americans in the streets of Brooklyn. Significantly, like many neighborhoods of that time period, there are no African Americans, Latinos in the neighborhood. And I write in the book, he's living in a religious ethnic cocoon in his neighborhood. He doesn't experience much in terms of anti-Semitism. He goes to James Madison High School, an elite public school, predominantly Jewish. And again, he's within a Jewish environment, although there's nothing Jewish in the curriculum. But as you said correctly, he's an outstanding football player. And one of the games, when he's a senior, he plays against Sid Luckman. It's Glickman and Luckman. Luckman goes on to be a player at Columbia University. It's interesting that he goes to Columbia. How he gets to Columbia is significant in terms of anti-Semitism and the NFL. They play for the Brooklyn Championship in Ebbets Field of blessed memory in front of 20,000 fans. That's how big the game was. And Glickman's team, Madison, beats Erasmus Hall. And the game is filmed. And if you went to a theater around the country, part of the newsreels of that time, you'd see Glickman and Luckman playing against one another. And for homework, your viewers and listeners can go to YouTube and see a 10-second or 15-second account of that game. You can see him playing football at James Madison, and he is recruited by 14 different schools around the country. They want to come and play football. So first part of his life is he's very comfortable in his environment as a Jew. There's a lot of anti-Semitism in America in the 1920s. And one of the tropes of my book is that it's also a book about anti-Semitism. He skirts that type of problem because he's living in a Jewish neighborhood, an inter-ethnic neighborhood. He has no interaction with WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, except maybe those who own the newsreels who broadcasted the game. So that's the first part of his life. He's doing so well, very comfortable as a Jew in New York. But then things are going to change for him. And that's when the story becomes very, very, very significant, transcending the theme of sports and getting to where Jews are at during this time period. And let me say one other thing. You were kind enough to mention that I'm a scholar of American Jewish history. For me, the sports experience is not the story of whether you win or lose, but whether you're allowed to play the game. About 50 years ago, when I was at Columbia University as a graduate student, I had an African-American professor who said, for minority groups, wars and sports are community-defining situations. Are you allowed to play? Are you allowed to compete for your town, your school, your country? Says a lot about where you are within America. But then he goes to Syracuse University, and perhaps we should talk about the.
Yeah, Jeff, tell us about that. So he decides on Syracuse, and it's he's kind of juggling the offers, such as they were. But it's an interesting approach to bring him to Syracuse. Tell us about the Jewish alumni who had an ulterior motive in bringing him to Syracuse.
Very, very much. This is a quixotic dream of a group of Jewish fraternity brothers from they're called Sammys, SAM fraternity, who have the idea that if we bring up an outstanding Jewish athlete to Syracuse, that will make life better for Jews who want to go to Syracuse and can't go to Syracuse because of quotas, and who are having a negative experience within that time period. As you know, and your listeners and viewers should know, the 1920s and 30s were a very difficult time for Jews who aspired to go for higher education. Of course, if they're in New York, they could go to City College, or women go to Hunter College, but they go elsewhere, there are quotas. So is this dream that an athlete could be so good and so, bring so much pride to Syracuse that it would open up doors for a variety of Jews. And I want you to know that Syracuse was not the worst offenders. There were some institutions that didn't even want Jewish sports heroes because they felt that Jews didn't fit in as far as the team is concerned. Again, Dan, it's are you allowed to play? So Glickman goes to Syracuse. He does very well as a football player, and of course, as a track man. That's his real
love was track, though, wasn't it? I mean, track and field was. I mean, he was a fine football player, but it seems that the track, and he always had his eyes on the Olympics. Correct?
His dream from the time he was in junior high school was to compete in the 1936 Berlin Games. We didn't know that back then, that this would be Hitler's games and Berlin Games in 1936. In fact, in his junior high school yearbook, one of his teachers wrote, "I'll see you in 1936 in the Olympics." So he's a fine football player, but he, as you correctly say, he's an outstanding track man, and he makes the 1936 Olympic team, where he's going to compete. He's going to be with people like Jesse Owens, Ralph Metcalf, Mac Robinson, who had a pretty important brother named Jackie Robinson. They go to Berlin with a dream of winning. He has a dream of winning a gold medal, standing on the victory stand. And if this 17-year-old boy thought about it seriously, to show the Nazis, much like Jesse Owens shows the Nazis, that their myths of racial superiority didn't work. When he gets to Germany, again, he's doing quite well. He gets to the Olympic Village, and he's saluting, and he's being saluted by Nazi guards. He knows Yiddish. He speaks Yiddish. They speak German back to him. There's a funny story that he tells. By the way, Glickman wrote 3 memoirs, which I read very carefully. One day, he and Herman Goldberg, who was a Jewish athlete on the baseball team. Yes, there was baseball as an exhibition game in Berlin. It was so boring for the German fans that they walked out of the stadium, but Herman Goldberg was the catcher on the team. They hitch a ride to the Olympic Stadium so they can see some of the events. And who's driving them? A lieutenant in the Wehrmacht, who's so thrilled to have these American athletes in his car. At the end, they asked the boys for their autographs. They scribble their names because not sure how this Wehrmacht lieutenant will take to Goldberg and Glickman, giving him the autograph. So everything is going great for him. Again, there's a lot of anti-Semitism in the world. There's a lot of obviously this is the Berlin Games, but he experiences this searing moment a day before he's supposed to compete in a signature event, a 4x100 meter relay race in front of 80,000 people in the Berlin Stadium, including Goebbels and Goering and, of course, Adolf Hitler. In walk the track coaches, and they informed the team that they heard a rumor that the Germans were hiding some great runners, and therefore Glickman and Sam Stoller, the other often forgotten Jewish athlete on that team, you're out. Jesse Owens, you're back in. This will be your fourth race, along with one other runner. Owens jumps up and says, to his credit, hey, I got 3 gold medals already. I don't need a 4th. They tell him, boy, sit down, and shut up. That's how blacks were referred to, and that's how athletes were referred to. Make a long story short, Glickman and Stoller do not get a chance to run. And the guy behind this, everyone should know, is not only the track coaches, but the head of the American Olympic Committee. His name is Avery Brundage. And if you permit me to say this, Avery Brundage, Yamach Shemo, one of the great anti-Semites of the 20th century, who is clearly a friend of the Germans and does not want Hitler to be embarrassed by seeing Jews on the victory stand. And I want everyone to remember not only 1936, when Glickman and Stoller are sidelined, this Avery Brundage is still around 36 years later when the Olympics return to Germany, not to Berlin, but to Munich. And 11 Israeli athletes are murdered by Palestinian terrorists. It's an event which everybody should remember. And the person who says the games must go on is the head of the International Olympic Committee. And his name is Avery Brundage. And one last thing about Brundage. Recently, I read a wonderful biography of Jim Thorpe, written by David Mariaschin, a Pulitzer Prize writer, who talks about the fact that the 1912 Stockholm Games, Jim Thorpe loses his gold medals because he's accused, perhaps correctly, of violating a minor rule in the Olympics. Namely, he played a little bit of semi-pro baseball. And you know who's behind it? The young Avery Brundage. That gives you a big vista about how the Olympics were a forum for exposing Glickman to anti-Semitism that he had never experienced before. It's a searing moment for Glickman.
Jeff, in the beginning, it seemed that, and maybe for decades actually, Marty waited quite a while before letting his anger out or conveying the trauma that he must have received. How do you explain that? Because in the later years, he did interviews. I think he appeared at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum to talk about this. Sure. He visited Berlin twice, and it all of a sudden it all came kind of pouring out. How do you explain the earlier phase and then the later phase?
Very difficult question and important question. You're correct. Glickman, when asked what happened to him in 1936 and subsequently, he talked about nepotism because the track coaches, Dean Cromwell, who is a coach from USC, and I'll talk more about him in a moment, wanted his guys to compete. For me, I think it represents a certain reaction of his generation of American Jews when they experienced anti-Semitism, and there were other incidences of anti-Semitism, to downplay it, move on with your life, and not speak out explicitly about what happened to him. Glickman's consciousness is raised by the fact that as we move towards the end of the 20th century, where American Jews become more aware of what happened to our people during the war and are willing to be outspoken about anti-Semitism, that his consciousness is raised and as you said correctly, he goes back to Berlin and he has another searing moment when in fact he goes to the Olympic Stadium and he looks up where Hitler had sat and says, "I'm here, you're not here. Damn Avery Brundage." And he will travel the country in the last almost 20 years of his life on behalf of the U.S. Holocaust Museum to talk about anti-Semitism and what happened to him. And he becomes a spokesman for Jewish memory with reference to the Holocaust.
But that wasn't the only incident of anti-Semitism that he encountered, because later on, as he started his broadcasting career, he was such a fine broadcaster.
Right.
I mean, I just, my own experience was I was a New York Giant, am a New York Giants football fan, living in New England, and that wasn't easy. But in those days, the Boston Patriots were just kind of getting started, as they were called then, not the New England Patriots. And so the New York Giants games were kind of on TV, came on CBS, I think it was. Chris Schenkel did the play-by-play,
Right.
but Marty Glickman did the radio broadcast. And I used to fiddle with the radio to get, I think it was WNEW, to bring in Marty Glickman and Al DeRogatis. He was really the king of New York broadcasting. There was Mel Allen, of course, and there were Red Barber and others, but Marty Glickman did it all. So then
I have the same story, traveling upstate New York to pick up the Giants on Channel 3 from New Haven. We had an aunt and uncle who lived in Yorktown Heights. We would drive up to, and we'd watch the game, and we'd listen to Marty do the account on the radio. We're brothers as far as that's concerned.
But there was an opportunity. Now the NBA is beginning to come into its own. There's going to be a game of the week. Glickman has done a couple of games. He's not a couple of games. He did Knicks games. But now we've got the NBA, and it's going to be on NBC, and there's going to be a game of the week. Tell us about that.
Yes, one of his dreams was to be a nationally recognized broadcaster. We New Yorkers understood what Glickman represented, but he doesn't get a chance to do the game of the week because Marty Glickman sounds a lot like me. He's a New York Jew with a New York dialect, and the moguls who ran the NBA or the BAA, the Basketball Association of America, which preceded the NBA, felt that his voice and his name of Marty Glickman would not play well on the American street. And for me, Dan, the saddest part about this is that the two people who are instrumental, who are fearful of having someone like Marty Glickman, the New York of broadcasting, their names were the president of the BAA and the early NBA. His name was Maurice Podoloff, and his sidekick was Haskell Cohen. Now, in one of his memoirs, Glickman, who was so hurt by this, but he said, "I must go on with my career," referred to them as Jewish anti-Semites. My definition of anti-Semites: Jews cannot be anti-Semites. They can be self-hating Jews in it, but these were fearful Jews about what Jewish voices would sound within America. And for me, that's another piece to the story. He refuses to change his name. He wants to be Marty Glickman, not Marty Manning or whatever it might be. And I contrast this, or I parallel this, that in 1947, I believe, there's a young woman who grows up in the Bronx who aspires to be Miss America. Her name is Bess Mariaschin, and she's pressured to change her name, and she refuses. So you know what, Dan? This has nothing to do with sports. It has to do with the status of Jews within America and how their image plays on the American street. You mentioned Mel Allen. His name was Mel Allen Israel. He changed his name because, again, he recognized that Mel Allen would sound too Jewish. Of course, he had an Alabama accent, so that was sort of interesting in that regard. But here's another very important theme: how Jews are accepted and not accepted, and their passivity with reference to anti-Semitism. And you know what? There's another incident that's sort of interesting. When he comes back from Berlin, he goes to the New York Athletic Club. He goes to work out at the New York Athletic Club, which was a great center for Protestant athletics in America, due south of Central Park. He's going to work out with a friend of his who's a Gentile. He gets to the door, and he's turned away because he's a Jew. Hey, I'm an Olympic athlete, but ultimately I'm a Jew. So this tells us a great deal about anti-Semitism during that particular time period. And I should tell you a family story. We had in our home what we call the purloined towel. This is not in the book, but I'm telling you this. Okay, my dad, whose picture is on the wall to my right, was a wrestler. He wrestled for the 92nd Street Y. By the way, he changed his name when he wrestled. His nom de guerre was Jack Austin because he didn't want his mother to know that he was becoming a wrestler. But that's a story for a different time. At one point, the Jewish Y wrestled against the New York Athletic Club. On the way out, my father stole a towel because it was symbolic to him. That's as close as a Jew could get to New York AC. Now, it's not in the book, but I've been talking about it a lot because it reflects on the images of Jews along those lines. And again, he never met, towards the end of his life, ironically, NBC turns to him to mentor so many young broadcasters. Now, Marty was too much of a gentleman. I'm less the gentleman. He never says, well, 50 years ago, you let me broadcast, but now I'm the Rebbe, I'm the teacher. But he's very happy. And he, again, as I mentioned previously, he mentors men and women, so many of the great broadcasters today. And one of the joys of the book, I got to tell you, was I got to meet through emails and Zooms so many of the contemporary leaders of the broadcasting world. And there's a chapter called Marty as Mentor, and about all the athletes who became broadcasters who said Marty Glickman was a very special person. Can I tell you who my favorite interview was? Do you have a minute for that?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. My favorite interview was with Bill Walton, the great basketball player. Someone told me, you got to speak to Walton. So I sent him an email. And the way I get to speak to these people was I send them an email. My name is Jeff Gurock. I'm a teacher at Yeshiva University. I have a book contract, and I don't want any money from you. If you're interested in speaking to me, speak to me right away. If you don't get back to me in a couple of days, I know you're not interested. But they all got back to me. But Walton gets back to me immediately, says, we have to talk. And he tells me that, and I didn't know this, but I saw this on HBO a few months ago. He stammered and stuttered a lot as a kid. This is Bill Walton. Marty Glickman had the same problem as a youngster. Glickman helped him get over his stammering. So when Glickman died in 2001, and he said that Glickman was almost as important to me as John Wooden, the great UCLA coach, his coach. I said, why was so important? Because he taught me to speak properly. So when Glickman died, there's a great line. Wooden is interviewed about Glickman, and they ask him, well, what do you think of Marty Glickman? He says he was okay, just okay. He says he taught Walton to speak, and now Walton never shuts up. So that was, and for me as a sports fan, I get the chance to speak to Bill Walton. So it was a scholarly endeavor, a labor of love in many respects, and a lot of people enjoy reading it because it brings back for you and for so many other people, their lives as youngsters in New York. But again, it is a book about the American Jewish experience, about marginality, about anti-Semitism, and the fact that even someone as outstanding as Glickman could not avoid that scourge of anti-Semitism. And I think the big difference today, we're living through a very difficult period, is that American Jews are more willing to be outspoken in terms of response. We need more of that at this point. So it's a period piece about a second generation Jew who tries to make it in America and all the difficulties you face in making it.
You know, Jeff, I think there's a lot of, as I read the book, there's just a lot of what if. What if he would have been on that track that day? What if NBC had signed off and said, this is the go-to guy. He's the best basketball broadcaster, calls the best games in the country. And it kind of sad, kind of wistful at the end, where he lets all of this out, which he was carrying with him, obviously, so much of his life, and then settles into the mentor role, which is so important because there are still guys on the air who, as you pointed out, who were really influenced by him. I would just say one other thing before we close, that this really is an important book if one wants to get into the discussion about global anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism here in the United States today, because it's very interesting. You basically go through the period of the 40s, 50s, 60s, let's say, where we were moving toward a point, and you talk about this in the book, moving toward a point where we were not only accepted, but where we excelled. And now, where you have young people who say, you know, I'm concerned about wearing a kippah, I'm concerned about wearing a Magen David, and kind of like pulling in, and then, of course, all of the issues that we have with universities today. It seems not that we've gone full circle, but that we seem to be, in certain ways, regressing, and we need to be able to deal with it. And I think that your book is really a tremendous contribution to understanding where we've been and perhaps where we still want to be.
Well, if I can close with some good news, notwithstanding everything you said. Before the book came out, I sent galleys to a young conservative rabbi in Los Angeles who was about to give a speech to the USC track team that was about to go to Auschwitz on a consciousness-raising tour. There were no Jews on that team. Most of them were African Americans, whatever. And he took my book with him, and he made the speech, and he talked about Marty Glickman and what happened to him. In 1936, Dean Cromwell, whose name has just been taken off the stadium of the track team at USC because he was a supporter of the German-American Bund and of Nazism, and it was known in LA back then into the 60s that Jews were not wanted on USC sports. With all the stuff that's going on, it warmed me, and I have to say, again, it's not in the book because it came after the book was finished, that this book could be used to tell other people what Jewish life was like to a group that's willing to listen to our voices. And before they go to Auschwitz, they learn about Marty Glickman. So that is one of the warming experiences that the book has been very important to me. And it's just a very important moment in time.
Indeed. So the book is, here it is, Marty Glickman, The Life of an American Jewish Sports Legend by Jeffrey Gurock. It's available now wherever you purchase books via New York University Press. Jeff, as we wrap up, I want to thank you again for sharing Marty Glickman's story of adversity and triumph. You've written eloquently about an American Jewish sports legend and one of America's most iconic sports voices. So great that you could join us, and wishing you continued success with the book.
Thank you, Dan. It's so nice to reconnect with you.
Well, this wraps up another fantastic episode of the Conversations with B'nai B'rith podcast. Thank you to my guest, Jeffrey Gurock, professor of Jewish history at Yeshiva University, for joining us, and to you for listening and viewing our show today. Remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Share this episode with friends, post it on social media, or leave us a comment or a rating. We'd love to hear from you. For all of our latest content, and if you haven't already, follow or subscribe to Conversations with B'nai B'rith wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel, and of course, like us on Facebook. Stay tuned for more exciting content in our next episode. Until then, for my guest, Jeff Gurock, this is your host, Dan Mariaschin. Take care, everyone.